It's a family feud that has echoed for 4,000 years. A conflict that spills blood onto holy ground and completely dominates our headlines. It's a rivalry between two peoples, both bound by a common ancestor, yet they seem to be locked in a permanent state of war. We're talking, of course, about Jews and Arabs. Now, the common explanation points to modern politics, right? Disputed borders drawn in the sand, and the clash of nationalisms in the 20th century. But what if that's just the surface layer? What if the real root of this fight isn't in the last century, but in the last 4,000 years? What if the original wound wasn't inflicted in a parliament or on a battlefield, but inside a tent in the ancient desert, between two women and their two sons? The story of the modern Middle East is a tangled mess of politics, religion, and land. But the Bible suggests a much older, much more personal starting point, a sibling rivalry. It claims this entire saga began with two brothers, born to the same father but different mothers, who were thrown onto two completely different paths by a divine promise and a painful rejection. This isn't just ancient history. According to the biblical story, it's prophecy. A prophecy that doesn't just foretell a future of hostility, but also hides a shocking final chapter of reconciliation that most people have never even heard about. To understand the war, you first have to understand the family. Our story starts not with nations, but with a single man and his wife, wandering the stark, unforgiving deserts of the ancient Near East. His name was Abram, later known as Abraham. Her name was Sarai, later Sarah. They were nomads, rich in livestock and silver, but they were missing the one thing they wanted most: a child. The book of Genesis paints this really poignant picture of their life. They're guided by a voice, a promise from God Himself. And this promise is huge. It's threefold. First, God tells Abram, "I will make you into a great nation." Second, "I will make your name great." And third, the most staggering of all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. It's a promise of a legacy, a dynasty, a significance that would ripple through all of human history. But there was a glaring, painful problem at the heart of this divine plan. The man promised to be the father of a great nation had no son. His wife, Sarai, was barren. In their world, without modern medicine or any kind of social safety net, being barren wasn't just a personal sadness. It was a mark of shame. It was a dead end for your family line. A woman's value was deeply tied to her ability to produce an heir. Every month that passed was just another silent reminder of their perceived failure, a huge question mark hanging over God's big announcement. Years turned into a decade. Abram and Sarai got older. That promise, which was once this source of burning hope, must have started to feel like a distant mirage in the desert heat. The silence from Sarai's womb was deafening, a constant challenge to their faith. How could a great nation possibly spring from a man whose hair was turning gray, and whose wife was long past the age of having children? This is the pressure cooker where the conflict was forged, in the waiting, in the doubting, and in the very human desperation to help God keep His promise. Sarai, just weighed down by years of disappointment and the cultural shame of her infertility, comes up with a plan. It was a plan that was culturally acceptable for the time, a practical solution born from a faith that had started to fray around the edges. She looks at her Egyptian handmaiden, a young servant named Hagar, and sees not just a servant, but a solution, a means to an end. In Genesis chapter 16, Sarai says to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." It's a statement just dripping with resignation and a hint of manipulation. She's giving up on the miracle she was promised and taking matters into her own hands. She's trying to build a family through human effort, through a surrogate. instead of waiting for the divine intervention that seemed like it was never going to come. Abram, now 85 years old, agrees. The text doesn't show him protesting or even appealing to God one last time. Maybe his own faith was worn thin. Maybe he was just tired of seeing the sorrow in his wife's eyes. He goes along with her plan. And this single act of impatience, this decision born from a mix of love, despair, and shaky trust in God's timing, sets off a chain reaction that will create not one, but two peoples, and sow the seeds of a rivalry that would last for millennia. They thought they were solving a problem, securing the promise God was too slow to deliver. They had no idea they were opening a Pandora's box of jealousy, rejection, and strife that would echo down through their descendants for generations. The stage was set. The key players were in place: an aging patriarch, a desperate wife, and a young, powerless servant girl caught in the middle of a divine drama she never chose. A son was about to be born, but he wasn't the son of the promise. He would be the son of human effort, and his arrival would change everything. The plan, at least at first, seemed to work. Hagar, the Egyptian servant, conceived a child with Abram. But what Sarai thought was a solution quickly became a new and much more bitter problem. The second Hagar knew she was pregnant, the power dynamics in that little nomadic household shifted, big time. Genesis tells us that when Hagar conceived, she began to despise her mistress. For the first time, Hagar had a status that Sarai, the matriarch, didn't. She was carrying Abram's heir. She wasn't just a servant anymore. She was the mother of the future. And Sarai, the one who cooked up this whole arrangement, was now slapped in the face with the consequences of her own lack of faith. She looked into Hagar's eyes and saw contempt, not gratitude. The jealousy and resentment that had been simmering in Sarai's heart just boiled over. She turned on Abram, her voice sharp with accusation. "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me." It's a classic case of passing the buck, refusing to take responsibility for a plan she came up with. Sarai then began to deal harshly with Hagar. The Bible uses a word that means she afflicted and mistreated her. The home that was supposed to be the cradle of a great nation became a place of domestic abuse. Hagar, pregnant, alone, and abused, did the only thing she could do. She ran. She fled from her mistress's cruelty, deep into the desert. And it's here, in her moment of total desperation, that the story takes a divine turn. The angel of the Lord finds her by a spring in the wilderness. This is a huge moment. God steps in, not to scold Hagar, but to see her, to hear her, and to make a promise to her. He tells her to go back and submit to Sarai, but he also gives her a promise that sounds a lot like the one he gave to Abram. "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count," the angel declares. He's telling this outcast slave girl that she too will be the matriarch of a massive family. Then comes the prophecy, a birth announcement that's both a blessing and a stark warning. The angel says, "You will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery." The name Ishmael itself means God hears. It was a permanent reminder that in her darkest hour, when she was invisible to her master and mistress, she was seen and heard by God. But the prophecy continues with a description of her son that has been debated for thousands of years. In Genesis 16, verse 12, the angel says, "He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." For centuries, this verse has been held up as the reason for the endless conflict between Arabs and Jews. The imagery sounds pretty negative, right? A wild donkey of a man suggests someone untamable, rebellious, and fiercely independent. His hand will be against everyone, paints a picture of a man and a people destined for a life of conflict. This reading of the text sees all the wars and violence as a direct fulfillment of this ancient prediction. But if you take a deeper look, especially through a Middle Eastern cultural lens, you get a much more nuanced picture. In that harsh desert culture, being called a wild donkey wasn't necessarily an insult. It was a symbol of freedom, of strength, and the incredible ability to survive and even thrive where others would die. To Hagar, a slave who had just been abused, the promise that her son would be free and untamable might have sounded less like a curse and more like an incredible blessing. He wouldn't be trampled on like she had been. Also, the Hebrew phrase translated as live in hostility toward his brothers is complex. It can also be translated as dwell in the presence of, or settle near, all his relatives. Some Hebrew scholars argue that the context points not to inevitable war, but to a promise of presence and closeness. Ishmael's descendants wouldn't be a forgotten people, but would always live right alongside their relatives, the descendants of Isaac. The prophecy, in this light, isn't necessarily about unending war, but about a perpetual, often difficult, but inescapable relationship. Hagar returns, and Ishmael is born. For 13 years, he's Abram's only son. He is the heir, the living, breathing answer to a lifetime of prayer, even if he came in through a side door. Abram loves him. When God later reaffirms his covenant, Abram's first instinct is to plead for his firstborn, crying out, "If only Ishmael might live under your blessing." This wasn't some unwanted child. He was a beloved son. But he was not the son of the covenant. He was the product of human impatience, and soon the son of divine promise would arrive, creating a split that would tear the family apart. 13 years went by. 13 years for Ishmael to grow from a baby into a teenager. He would have learned the ways of the desert from his father, Abram. He was the firstborn, the only son, the focus of his father's love, and the presumed heir to everything. But then, the impossible happened. God appeared to Abram again, now 99 years old, and renewed the covenant with a jaw-dropping announcement. "I will surely return to you about this time next year," God declared, "and Sarah your wife will have a son." The text tells us Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent, and she laughed. It wasn't a laugh of joy. It was a laugh of pure cynical disbelief. She was 90. Her husband was 100. The idea was biologically ridiculous, a cruel joke after a lifetime of waiting. But God's promise wasn't limited by human biology. Exactly as he had said, 1 year later, Sarah gave birth to a son. They named him Isaac, which comes from the Hebrew word for laughter, a permanent reminder of his mother's doubt and God's miracle. The birth of Isaac changed everything. He was the miracle baby, the true heir of the covenant, the one through whom God's promises would flow. And as he grew, the tension that was always simmering in the household finally boiled over. The Bible points to a feast celebrating Isaac's weaning, which was a huge deal in that culture. During the party, Sarah saw Ishmael, now a teenager, maybe 16 or 17 years old, mocking Isaac. The Hebrew word used here is actually related to the word for laughter, the same root as Isaac's name. It could mean he was just playing, but Sarah saw it as scornful, cruel laughter. She saw the son of the slave woman making fun of her precious miracle son. For Sarah, that was it. Her protective motherly instinct, mixed with years of pent-up jealousy and insecurity, just exploded. She went to Abraham and gave him an ultimatum, her words cold and final. "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." She doesn't even use their names. They are that slave woman and her son. In her mind, the separation is complete. There can't be two heirs. Ishmael had to go. This was deeply distressing to Abraham. This was his firstborn son, Ishmael. He loved him. To cast him and his mother out into the brutal wilderness was basically a death sentence. Abraham was trapped, torn between his wife's fierce demands and his love for his son. In his anguish, he turns to God, and God's response is both heartbreaking and clear. He tells Abraham to listen to his wife. "Do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman," God says. "Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." The line of the covenant is confirmed. Isaac is the chosen one. But then God speaks a word of comfort and promise for the boy who is about to be cast out. "I will make the son of the slave into a nation also," God reassures Abraham, "because he is your offspring." Ishmael isn't forgotten. He isn't cursed. He is also blessed, also promised a future as the father of a great nation, but his path will be separate. Being blessed didn't mean he was chosen for the covenant. So, early the next morning, with a heavy heart, Abraham obeyed. He took some food and a skin of water, put them on Hagar's shoulders, and sent her and their son away into the wilderness. It was an act of painful separation, the physical split that showed the spiritual division that had been growing for years. The two brothers, Isaac and Ishmael, were now on two different paths, their descendants destined to become two great peoples. Hagar and Ishmael wandered in the desert until their water ran out. In complete despair, Hagar put her son under a bush, walked a little ways off, and just sat down and wept, unable to watch him die. And once again, in her moment of deepest pain, God heard. The angel of God called out from heaven, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She filled the skin, gave her son a drink, and their lives were saved. The Bible then sums up Ishmael's life in a few short verses. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an archer. His mother got a wife for him from Egypt. He becomes the father of 12 tribal chiefs, 12 princes, fulfilling the promise God made to Abraham. He and his descendants would become a nomadic people of the desert, embodying that spirit of the wild donkey, free, independent, and tough. But the wound of rejection, the reality of being the firstborn son who was cast aside for the second, would leave a deep mark on the psyche of his people. The story of these two brothers isn't good versus evil. It's a tragedy, born of human weakness and God's plan. A story of two sons, both blessed, but set on paths that would forever run parallel and often in opposition. Being kicked out of Abraham's camp wasn't the end of Ishmael's story. It was the beginning of a new one. Cast out from the center of God's covenant, Ishmael and his descendants carved out their own destiny in the vast, dry lands of the Arabian Peninsula. The Bible confirms that God kept his promise to Hagar and Abraham. Ishmael became the father of a great nation. Genesis 25 lists his 12 sons by name: Nebaioth, Kedar, Adbeel, and so on, noting they became 12 tribal rulers. These Ishmaelites became a serious force. They were nomads, traders, and warriors who knew how to thrive in the desert. Historically, they're identified with powerful tribes that controlled the valuable incense trade routes. While the idea that all modern Arabs are direct genealogical descendants of Ishmael came later, the symbolic connection is powerful. Ishmael is traditionally honored as the father of the Arab peoples, just as his brother Isaac is seen as the forefather of the Jewish people. Isaac's path was different. He was the child of promise, the one who inherited the covenant. He didn't wander the desert. He stayed in the land of Canaan, the land promised to his father. His life was quieter, less dramatic than his father's or his son's. He married Rebekah, and after 20 years, mirroring his own parents' struggle, she gave birth to twin sons, Esau and Jacob. And guess what? The sibling rivalry that marked the first generation popped right back up in the second. Esau, the rugged outdoorsman, and Jacob, the quiet mama's boy, were fighting from the womb. Their story is full of deception and stolen blessings, which ends with Jacob literally running for his life from his angry brother. It's Jacob, whose name is later changed to Israel, who would have 12 sons of his own. These 12 sons would become the leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel, the nation that would carry the covenant into the future. So, from one father, Abraham, you get two major family lines. Through Isaac and Jacob came the nation of Israel. Through Ishmael came the tribes that would fill the Arabian deserts. For a while, their paths split, and they didn't interact much, but they were never totally disconnected. The brothers were bound to meet again. One of the most moving and often overlooked verses in Genesis comes right after Abraham's death. Genesis 25:9 says simply, "His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah." After decades of being apart, after all the pain of the expulsion, the two brothers come together. They stand side by side to honor the father they shared. This act of mourning together is a powerful symbol. It shows that despite the division, a family bond remained. Jewish tradition sees huge significance in this moment. The Midrash, a collection of ancient rabbinic commentary, points out that Isaac is named before the older brother Ishmael. This is seen as a sign that Ishmael had a change of heart, or at least made a gesture of peace, letting his younger brother, the heir of the covenant, take the lead. It's seen as a prophetic hint that a future reconciliation between their descendants is actually possible. The Bible even records other moments where the two families came together. Esau, Isaac's son, marries a daughter of Ishmael, directly connecting the two lines. Generations later, at the height of Israel's power under King David, we see Ishmaelites in high positions. An Ishmaelite was put in charge of King David's camel herds. Even more amazing, David's sister married an Ishmaelite. Their son, Amasa, who was half Israelite and half Arab, wasn't just accepted. David made him the commander of Israel's entire army, calling his half-Arab nephew, "my own flesh and blood." That shows a level of trust and integration that completely contradicts the idea of a permanent, biblically required state of war. But these moments of cooperation exist right alongside the fulfillment of the other side of the prophecy. After Ishmael's death, Genesis notes that his descendants lived in hostility toward all their brothers. This prediction of strife wasn't just about conflict with the Israelites, but also hinted at conflicts among the Arab tribes themselves. The history of the region is filled with these kinds of rivalries, a continuous thread of tribal warfare that many see as the direct result of that ancient oracle spoken to Hagar in the desert. So the Bible lays out this complex dual destiny for the descendants of these two brothers. They are relatives, forever linked by the blood of their father, Abraham. They share moments of connection, cooperation, and even family unity. And yet, they are also marked by a prophecy of hostility, a recurring pattern of conflict and rivalry. Both threads, peace and strife, are woven into the fabric of their shared history, setting the stage for the explosive clashes of our time. For centuries, the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael grew along their separate, though sometimes connected, paths. The Israelites formed a kingdom, built temples, were sent into exile, and returned. The Ishmaelite tribes roamed the deserts, built trade empires, and fought their own battles. While there were tensions, the ancient sibling rivalry wasn't some kind of constant, all-out holy war. The idea of a permanent biblical war between Jews and Arabs as two single groups is really just us projecting our modern world onto ancient texts. The real shift from an ancient family drama to a modern geopolitical nightmare started much later. The rise of Islam in the 7th century AD completely reshaped the identity of the Arab peoples. The Quranic story honors Abraham and Ishmael, and Islamic tradition holds that it was Ishmael, not Isaac, whom Abraham was told to sacrifice. This theological split created a new layer of religious rivalry over which son was the true spiritual heir. Still, even then, the relationship between Jews, Christians, and Muslims in the region had its ups and downs, with long periods of coexistence as well as conflict. The real trigger for the modern Arab-Israeli conflict came in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with the rise of two competing national movements, Zionism and Arab nationalism. Jewish communities, facing horrific persecution in Europe, began to organize politically to create a national homeland in their ancestral land, a movement called Zionism. At the very same time, Arab peoples in the region were developing their own sense of national identity and a desire for independence as the Ottoman Empire fell apart. Both movements laid claim to the exact same narrow strip of land. Jewish claims were rooted in the Bible story of the Promised Land and a 3,000-year-old continuous presence. Arab claims were based on centuries of living on the land, a deep cultural and religious presence, and the right to self-rule. All of a sudden, the two brothers weren't just living near each other. They were in a zero-sum fight for the same inheritance, the same piece of property. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 brought this conflict to a boiling point. For the Jewish people, it was the miraculous fulfillment of a 2,000-year-old dream. For the surrounding Arab nations and the Palestinian Arabs, it was the Nakba, or the catastrophe, a moment of being displaced and defeated. In this explosive new environment, the old story of Isaac and Ishmael was weaponized. It stopped being just a story about two brothers and became a powerful myth to explain and justify the modern conflict. It provided what felt like a divine reason for the hatred. The story was simplified. Isaac's descendants, the Jews, versus Ishmael's descendants, the Arabs, locked in the eternal struggle prophesied in Genesis. This framing stripped the conflict of all its complex political and historical details and turned it into an inevitable fated clash of destinies. This interpretation took a strong hold, especially in certain Christian circles, like Christian Zionism. For many, the rebirth of Israel was seen as a direct fulfillment of biblical prophecy, a necessary step before the end times and the return of Christ. In this view, the conflict isn't just political, it's a cosmic battle, and supporting Israel becomes a religious duty. This perspective often sees the Arab position as nothing more than the continuation of Ishmael's prophesied hostility, an obstacle to God's plan. On the other side, the story of Ishmael as the rejected son also resonated deeply within the Arab and Muslim world. It fed a sense of historical grievance, the feeling of being wronged and pushed aside by a younger brother who was favored by outside powers. The fight over land got tangled up with a spiritual custody battle over Abraham's legacy. Who were his true heirs? Who did the Holy Land really belong to? The fight wasn't just about territory anymore. It became theological. And so, a conflict rooted in 20th century nationalism and politics was given the ancient, unyielding weight of divine prophecy. Every war, every terror attack, every failed peace talk was seen through this lens. The prophecy of Genesis 16:12, "His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him," became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because both sides, and influential people watching, believed they were destined to be enemies, they acted like enemies, continuing a cycle of violence that seemed to prove the ancient text right. But in focusing only on the verses about conflict, a huge part of the biblical story was forgotten. The story of a shared ancestor, of the brothers mourning together, of the Ishmaelite general leading Israel's army, all of that was ignored. And most importantly, the prophecies that speak not of perpetual war, but of a shocking and miraculous future reconciliation, were left unread. The Bible's answer to the conflict isn't just an explanation of how it started. It also contains a vision for how it ends, a vision that looks radically different from the world we see today. While the story of Isaac and Ishmael is often used to explain an endless war, the Bible itself seems to hint at a very different ending. The prophetic books, which are often full of judgment and conflict, also contain these breathtaking visions of a future where sworn enemies are brought together and ancient wounds are healed. One of the most stunning and overlooked of these prophecies is found in the book of Isaiah, chapter 19. Isaiah 19 starts with a harsh prophecy against Egypt, one of Israel's oldest and most powerful enemies. The prophet predicts civil war, economic collapse, and spiritual chaos. "I will stir up Egyptian against Egyptian," the Lord declares. "Kingdom will fight against kingdom." It's a picture of total collapse. But then, right in the middle of this prophecy of doom, the tone shifts dramatically. The prophet looks far into the future, to a time called that day, which in the Bible usually means the end times or the age of the Messiah. In that day, Isaiah says, the Egyptians, after being struck down, will be healed. They will turn to the Lord, and he will hear them. They will cry out to the Lord because of their oppressors, Isaiah writes, and he will send them a savior and defender, and he will rescue them. Then the prophecy gets even bigger, pulling in another one of Israel's most feared and brutal enemies, Assyria. The Assyrians were notorious for their ruthless, savage cruelty. Yet, Isaiah sees a time when even they will turn to the God of Israel. What comes next is one of the most radical visions of peace in the entire Bible. Isaiah 19 verses 23 to 25 lays out a blueprint for a reconciled Middle East. In that day there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria. The Assyrians will go to Egypt and the Egyptians to Assyria. The Egyptians and Assyrians will worship together. In that day Israel will be the third, along with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing on the earth. The Lord Almighty will bless them, saying, "Blessed be Egypt, my people, Assyria my handiwork, and Israel my inheritance." Just let that sink in for a moment. Egypt, the original oppressor, will be called my people, a title normally just for Israel. Assyria, the symbol of brutal conquest, will be called my handiwork. And Israel will join them not as a superior, but as a partner, a third in a holy alliance that will bless the entire world. There will be a highway, a symbol of open borders, free travel, and peaceful trade, connecting these three former enemies. They will worship together, united under the same God. This isn't a vision of one nation dominating the others. It's a vision of mutual conversion and shared blessing. This prophecy smashes the narrative of perpetual war. The descendants of Ishmael and other Arab nations, represented here by the regional superpowers of Egypt and Assyria, whose ancient empire covered modern-day Iraq, Syria, and parts of Turkey and Iran, are not shown as eternal enemies doomed to destruction. Instead, they're shown as future partners in worship and blessing. This vision suggests the ultimate destiny of the Middle East isn't endless conflict, but a miraculous God-led reconciliation. And this theme isn't just in Isaiah. The Apostle Paul in the New Testament talks about a time when the fullness of the Gentiles will come in, and all of Israel will be saved, suggesting a grand, inclusive plan of redemption for everyone. He describes the work of the Messiah as breaking down the dividing wall of hostility to create one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace. While Paul was talking specifically about Jews and non-Jews in his time, The principle applies perfectly to the Isaac-Ishmael dynamic. The hope here is that the conflict that started with two brothers in a tent will ultimately be solved by a Messiah who makes everything new. The hostility declared over their descendants doesn't have to be the final word. The Bible holds out the hope that this ancient sibling rivalry will find its final resolution not in political treaties or military victories, but in a shared turning to the God of their common father, Abraham. This prophetic vision forces us to reread the entire story. It suggests that the conflict isn't the point of the story, but a tragic, multi-generational detour. The ultimate purpose of God's plan, which began with the promise that all peoples on earth will be blessed through Abraham, ends in a scene where the descendants of both his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, are brought together in peace. The journey has been full of hostility, but the final destination, according to the prophets, is a shared highway of worship. The story of Isaac and Ishmael is a powerful lens for looking at history, prophecy, and the conflicts that shape our world. It's a story full of complexities that defy easy answers. If this deep dive into the biblical roots of the Middle East conflict has sparked your curiosity, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We regularly explore these profound biblical stories to figure out what they mean for us today, and we want to hear from you. What part of this story, the family rivalry, the prophecy of conflict, or the vision of future peace, stood out to you the most? Leave your thoughts in the comments section below. Your insights are a huge part of this conversation. So, why are Jews and Arabs always at war? The Bible's answer is so much more complex than a political dispute or some fated eternal hatred. It tells us the conflict is rooted in a real human story of family problems, of impatience, jealousy, and rejection that happened 4,000 years ago. The decision by Abraham and Sarah to rush God's plan gave them two sons, two paths, and a prophecy of hostility that has shadowed their descendants for centuries. The modern Arab-Israeli conflict is, no question, a product of modern forces, of clashing nationalisms, of politics, and of the fight for land and sovereignty. And yet, you can't ignore how this ancient story has provided the spiritual and psychological blueprint for the conflict, making the divisions feel deeper, more inevitable, and divinely ordered. But to stop there, with the prophecy of conflict, is to read only half the story. The Bible is a book about redemption, and its story always bends toward reconciliation. The same prophets who speak of hostility also speak of a future where enemies worship together. The story that begins with two brothers being torn apart contains a hopeful vision of their distant descendants coming together to bury their father, a prophetic sign of possible peace. And it all leads to that breathtaking prophecy of a highway connecting Egypt, Assyria, and Israel, a vision of a reconciled Middle East, a blessing to the whole earth. The ultimate biblical answer, then, isn't a curse of endless war. It is a story that acknowledges the deep, painful roots of the conflict, but refuses to let that be the final word. It suggests that the division, born of human failure, can be healed by divine grace. The story of Isaac and Ishmael isn't just an explanation for why there is war. It is also a profound and often forgotten prophecy that there can one day be peace,